In that last section, I was just cut off where I was talking about that the energy that's released by the breaking down of larger food molecules into the smaller waste molecules, like the breakdown of glucose, releases energy that can be used to perform work. So the initial energy that's released when larger food molecules are broken down is, most of it is almost always transferred onto the ATP molecule, and then that ATP molecule, its energy, can then be used to perform specific work like muscle contraction, to move things. So with cellular respiration, this is occurring at the mitochondria. It's not labeled here, but make believe this blue circle is a mitochondrion within your cells, and that's where the breakdown of glucose occurs to release the energy in the chemical bonds of the atoms of glucose. Oxygen is utilized, and the energy that's released eventually gets transferred onto the ATP molecule. Some heat's lost. The waste molecules are carbon dioxide and water, and then that ATP molecule can be used to drive cellular work like muscle contraction. Okay? So cellular respiration within our cells in the mitochondria in animals is, actually in most living things, is the energy breakdown of food molecules, and the energy is put onto the ATP molecule. Okay? So the stored energy is now in a form that the cells can use directly. Like the analogy I use sometimes is, think of the ATP molecule as your debit card that you use to buy whatever you're going to buy, but the debit card gets money on it because you work, and then you get a paycheck, and the bank puts that money, makes it available to your ATM or your debit card, and then you use that to buy the things that you're buying. At the cellular level, the energy from the food that we eat and ingest gets broken down into glucose. When that gets into our cells, the steps of cellular respiration transfer the energy in the chemical bonds in glucose onto the energy in the chemical bonds in ATP. Now that high energy molecule is in your cells, and that high energy molecule is delivering the energy for things like cellular respiration, or say moving, vacuoles or vesicles around your cells. So humans are fairly efficient at this. About 34% of the food energy that we ingest and break down is transferred onto ATP. It's about a third. That sounds low, but it's actually pretty high in terms of utilizing energy from food and transferring it to ATP versus how much energy gets lost in the environment. So the rest of the energy is released through heat, body heat. And again, I mentioned when you exercise, you're breaking down a lot of glucose rapidly to generate a lot of ATP rapidly so that you can move your muscle cells rapidly. So a lot of heat's produced, generated, it heats up your cells, your tissues, your muscles, and then your bloodstream helps carry that excess heat to the surface of your body where it can radiate away into the environment. And then we also sweat, and the drying of the sweat also drives off a lot of heat. Excuse me. So ATP and cellular work. So the chemical energy that's released from, again, the breakdown of our food molecules in the steps called cellular respiration is used to transfer the energy from glucose, food molecule, onto the high energy molecule of ATP. And that's the abbreviation for something called adenosine triphosphate. And it's storing that energy that's derived from food, and now it releases it as needed to drive cellular work. So let's look at ATP a bit. It's an adenosine subunit molecule with 3 phosphate groups onto it, which is why it's called adenosine triphosphate. Okay? The chemical bond between the second and third phosphate right here is the high energy bond. When that energy bond gets broken, that chemical bond, it's a covalent bond, when it gets broken, energy is released. That energy can be used to drive things like muscle contraction, right? And then these are the lower energy containing waste molecules. Actually, they're not waste molecules, but just the byproduct molecules of the breakdown of ATP. Notice it says ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a separate phosphate group. Okay? So you're utilizing ATP all the time to do energy requiring work in your cells, like cell movement, muscle contraction, moving things, vacuoles, vesicles around in the cell, that sort of stuff. Now, how do we build up ATP molecules so that we can do cellular work? Break down food energy molecules like glucose. The energy that's released is used to drive that loose phosphate back onto adenosine diphosphate and regenerate that high energy bond to resynthesize or regenerate ATP. So it's like this run backwards. So broken down, ATP gets broken down into adenosine diphosphate, and in doing so, that high energy, or the energy, is released, again, for cellular work. Oh, so sorry guys, I'm hitting the wrong button here. Okay, so what type of work? Things like ATP provides energy for what type of work? Things like helping cells change their shape. Cells can move around, like white blood cells. How can they move around? Movement requires energy provided by ATP, moving all the components of the cytoskeleton, for example. Okay? Or doing things like muscle contraction, right? It requires ATP molecule providing the energy. Notice what's coming out at the end, lower energy ADP and phosphate. The energy has been used to move the components of our muscle proteins so that our muscles can move. This is zooming into one little unit within one muscle cell. Or transporting ions, remember charged atoms, or other substances across the membrane, like a biological membrane, right? Phospholipid bilayer here. Sometimes energy is required to move ions or substances across the membrane, especially if you're moving things against their concentration gradient, like the opposite of diffusion. So here, ATP molecule is used to drive this transport protein. Sometimes they're called pumps. And in this case, moving substances either into or out of the cell, depending on which way your cells want to move those substances or ions. And that would require energy. Again, especially if you're moving things in this example into the cell, if this is inside, and building up a concentration of the solutes or substances inside a cell. That's an energy requiring activity. Okay? Or driving the production of large molecules. We talked about how proteins get put together, right? Proteins, large molecules comprised of many, many individual amino acids. We talked about the amino acids get linked together, forming peptide bonds, and you link hundreds to thousands of amino acids together. Well, what's the energy that's driving that chemical bond formation? Because there's energy in the chemical bond. Well, in order to form a energy-containing chemical bond, energy has to be put in, right? Inputted. And that's through the ATP molecule that can provide the energy to form chemical bonds, to make large biological molecules like, say, starch for a plant, or say glycogen for a human, or a protein for a human, or a large DNA molecule, for example. All right, making larger molecules, building more and more chemical bonds requires energy. And again, ATP is providing that energy at the cellular level. So the cycling of ATP, I talked about it a little bit. So your cells are using ATP continuously, millions of them a second in your cells, up to millions a second. So that means you're constantly using this up, harnessing the energy. That means what happens to the ADP and the loose phosphate? They get linked back together, reestablishing that high energy bond. Well, that requires energy released from cellular respiration, right? The breakdown of things like glucose, breaking the chemical bonds, that releases energy. The energy is used to force this phosphate back onto ADP to resynthesize, remake, replenish our ATP molecules in our cells. So ATP is recycled when ADP and phosphate are combined, reestablishing that chemical bond, the high energy chemical bond. And again, that takes energy. Energy provided by the release of energy from the cellular respiration, chemical breakdown of things like glucose. You can use up to 10 million ATPs per second in a heavily active working muscle cell. Right? If you're at the gym or at home now working out vigorously, your muscle cells can be using up millions of ATPs per second per cell. So you're constantly recycling these components, right? And generating a lot of excess heat that heats up your body, and that's one reason why you sweat, or the main reason why you sweat when you exercise vigorously. Okay, so a little bit on enzymes, which are special proteins here in purple, I guess. Enzymes are special proteins that their job is to speed up chemical reactions. So going back to the breakdown of glucose through cellular respiration, in order to break those chemical bonds efficiently to release energy, enzymes are involved. And enzymes are also involved to make chemical bonds. So enzymes are essential for life. So metabolism is the word that's used to encompass all the chemical reactions within an organism. So we have cellular metabolism, all the chemical reactions in the cell. Organismal metabolism is all the chemical reactions in your body at any given time. So most metabolic reactions utilize enzymes, and these are special proteins, and their special function is to speed up how fast the chemical reactions are occurring. You can think of an enzyme as a really boring factory worker, but a factory worker that's super efficient and super fast. In the example here, milk sugar, something called lactose, is a disaccharide, right? Two monosaccharides linked together. It's the starting material, so it's called the substrate for a chemical reaction. The substrate, starting material, lactose, latches onto the enzyme, or the enzyme latches onto the substrate, lactose, in a special binding site that is specific for lactose. So enzymes have what's called substrate specificity. It's kind of like a lock and key, right? Only a specific lock will fit a specific key, okay? So only a specific substrate will fit the active site on a specific enzyme. So when the enzyme latches on to its substrate, here in this example lactose, what the enzyme does is it speeds up the chemical reaction, in this case of breaking the chemical bond between the two subunits of lactose and releasing those subunits as individual molecules, galactose and glucose. Right? And glucose should ring a bell, that's your blood sugar. Galactose can get converted into glucose by yet another enzyme. Okay? So when you drink milk or yogurt or something like that, cheese, you break down milk sugar via and quickly by this special enzyme, and it's called lactase. Here's the word, lactase. And it breaks down the larger molecule substrate into the smaller molecules, glucose and galactose. That's blood sugar ready to be broken down at the mitochondria to release ATP. Well, to release energy to make ATP. And then galactose would be converted into glucose to do the same thing. And then notice what the boring factory worker does. Just does the reaction again and again and again.